Bismillah walhamdulillah as-salatu was-salam ala rasulina wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So today we're in our 10th class. We're definitely past the halfway mark. And we're discussing today scientific signs as well as historical signs and future predictions in the Quran. So we're now starting to prove the inimitability of the Quran, that it's impossible for anything that is makhluk, that is created in this universe, to have come up with something like the Quran. So we're now going to give additional evidences to prove that it is beyond logical possibility that the Prophet ﷺ could have just simply guessed everything that should be in the Quran, and on top of the fact that there's already this immense linguistic structure that even the Quraysh, they couldn't imitate. So not only could they not imitate it in terms of the writing literary devices, but on top of that, they couldn't write the content that was involved within it with the perfection of accuracy. So when we start adding these layers to any rational human being who's sincere, it should be obvious that Islam is true. So that's the main goal for today. We're going to look at both scientific, historical, and future predictions. So one thing we need to discuss is if we bring in the venue or the dimension of scientific evidences, there are a few mashaykh online and some people who maybe from the previous generation, prior to my generation, so maybe people that are in, like, let's say their 50s and 60s, that are not really keen on using scientific ayat or the scientific aspect of the ayat. Some of the reasons why some people don't like this is because they say, well, it might backfire. But the thing is that there are really two types of scientific phenomena that could be discussed from the Quranic perspective. You could look at things which science has already confirmed. Those are called scientific facts or scientific laws. Or you could try to look at the Quran and try to look at some of the modern day scientific theories, and those would be the only issues that you would have a problem with possibly in the future. It wouldn't be a fault of the Quran, as I'm going to give you an example of where the Quran was always right, even during one of the times of one of the previous scientific theories during the time of the Golden Age. But the issue here is because science is kind of trying to catch its way up to the Quran. The Quran is based on the infinite knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if you talk about theories, theories can change in the scientific community. Theories can change, within months, days, sometimes years. Like the time differs, but the point is that they're not always sure about what they even think is correct. That's why there's no point in discussing scientific theories. We focus on scientific laws. So just to obviously point the difference here, a scientific theory is something that the scientific community thinks is plausible. They think that there might be some evidence, but that evidence is dhanni. It is speculative. It is not qat'i. It is not definitive. And therefore, you don't want to build an argument based on scientific theories because somebody might be anchoring their iman based on trying to correlate or match the theory with ayat of the Quran. So even though after some time, the scientists will figure out what theories are weak and which ones are not, you don't want to basically set somebody up with a shaky form of understanding the religion. Not to mention that some of this stuff is obviously open to interpretation. Scientific laws, as we said, are things that are already based on indisputable facts within the scientific community. So if you want to give examples of this, you would use things, for example, like the law of gravity, the law of thermodynamics, the Big Bang, mountains having deep roots or pegs, the water cycle, the stages of embryology, things that nobody could really argue about. And there are many references in books that you guys could use to enhance your knowledge on this and to basically have some manuals or some references that you could use to quickly generate these proofs. There's probably like maybe 5 or 6 books that I could recommend for you, but I'm going to recommend probably my top 3, which I actually put on the screen here today. So the first 2 books are relatively short, like under 100 pages, which is A Brief Illustrated Guide to Understanding Islam. This is illustrated, so it means you get pictures along with the ayat and giving the explanation based on science. So it's really nice, and you'll see a lot of these at, at the street dawah tables. So I remember this is actually one of the first little booklets that I read on Islam, and I was actually just blown away at how powerful how precise and how well organized this little dawah booklet actually is. And it's around maybe 60 to 80 something pages. Um, Scientific Truths in the Quran, similarly, around 60 to 80 pages. It's made by the Quran Project. They actually have a few other really nice publications, but one of them that they have, which is really nice, is the Scientific Truths in the Quran. So same idea, a nice little street dawah booklet, very good for you to just have maybe in your library or maybe even a hard copy of, just in case you have those types of discussions with non-Muslims. Then there's a book called The Eternal Challenge. The Eternal Challenge does not focus on just scientific ayat. It kind of does a blend of a lot of different angles on how to prove that Islam is true. So it talks about the literary miracle of the Quran. It talks about like how it was impossible for anybody to actually compete with it from a linguistic point of view. It talks about the scientific component. It talks about historical prophecies as well as future prophecies. So from multiple angles, just trying to prove that Islam is true. And it also discusses even the social concept, the fact that how Islam was really the only religion that brought complete holistic justice to the world, obviously when it's in practice. So looking at some examples, so this happened probably around 1200 CE in the Golden Era, around the time of Imam Ghazali, rahimahullah. The scientific community at that time was thinking that honey originates in the legs of the bees. Now, that's just what the scientists at the time they thought. Now the Quran, when it refers to where the bees get their honey, it mentions batuniha, which means from the bottom, from the stomach. Technically, this word has two meanings. Batan can mean something that is hidden inside, within, and it can mean specifically the stomach. So normally if you hear this word, one of these two meanings are going to come to your mind. The primary meaning is actually the stomach. And then the secondary meaning is just to be inside of something. So what some of the ulama of that time did is they kind of fell into the trap of trying to fit the theories of the time. We're not talking about established scientific laws. We're talking about the theory was that the honey was being created inside of the legs of the bees. They said the word batan can mean something hidden, something from inside. So therefore the legs obviously has an inner compartment. Therefore we're going to say that maybe or most likely that's what the ayah means. Then fast forward into the future, we now know for a fact that it actually happens within the stomach of the bee, which is both meanings of the word batan, both inside and the meaning of the stomach. So the Quran was right the entire time. In fact, the Quran was right in terms of both of the linguistic meanings of what it means for it to be within the stomach of the bee. And it was actually science that was lagging behind in terms of having the correct understanding. This is just an example to show you that the shakiness of focusing on theories when science contradicts itself all the time in terms of what it thinks it's right. But once something is an established fact, then you shouldn't have anything to worry about in terms of using scientific facts and comparing those to scientific ayat or signs in the Quran or the authentic Sunnah. These are some heavyweights in the da'wah scene. They're still living amongst us today. So among them is Hamza Andreas Sorsis. He's a Greek convert from the UK, and he mainly dealing with atheists. So you'll see him, for example, argue against people like Mr. Krauss and some of the other top atheists in the Western world today. And he'll be in, like, for example, in a 45 one-hour debate. He uses scientific ayat, but he also focuses heavily on ilm al-kalam or falsafa, so philosophy. I think he has a master's or a PhD in philosophy. So he uses philosophical arguments, kind of like how we sort of learned about logical fallacies, to sort of pinpoint the flaws in atheism and also to prove the necessary existence of Allah as a creator and to prove basically the quintessential point of having what you call absolute morality and why we need to have an anchoring absolute morality for a functioning society within humanity. So he has a book like, for example, I think it's called The Divine Message. He's also part of IERA. He's one of the main founders of the Islamic Education Research Academy in the UK. And so he's heavily involved with the dawah there. And IERA, as I've mentioned before, is one of the most active dawah organizations in the world right now. So he has a lot to do with that. And if you were to watch his videos on YouTube, you could pick up a lot of his skill sets in terms of how to give da'wah, not just to atheists, but also just his unique style of how he calls for Islam. And then there's also Dr. Zakir Naik. I would probably refer to him as the human encyclopedia because it appears to be that he's memorized the entire Quran. He seems to have most, if not all, of the Bible memorized because he is able to quote the verses of the Old and New Testament from memory without looking at any pages or papers, just like he does with the Quran. He's also memorized probably a good portion of ahadith as well, because when he quotes ahadith, he will tell you the book as well as the hadith number of whatever hadith that he's actually speaking about. So there's a lot to be learned from Dr. Zakir Naik. You can find videos of him on YouTube where he has crowds of like 50 or 100,000 people, and there are huge clusters of people that are making shahada at his venues and at his talks. So a lot to be learned from him. I remember learning from a lot of his videos early after my conversion to Islam, and he is considered basically Ahmed Didat 2.0. He is the main pupil or student of the famous Ahmed Didat, who, rahimahullah, may Allah have mercy on him, he passed away probably in the last decade or so. He used to be basically the heavyweight da'wah champion. Like if you were to ask people from one generation older than mine, they would tell you that Ahmed Didat, he was like the go-to guy, you know, to learn how to deal with comparative religion and how to prove Islam is true. So some more signs. So now we're getting into concrete things regarding science. So maybe a couple hundred years ago, it was still a mystery. How did the universe begin? But now we're starting to get pieces of the puzzle. Even things that the scientific community basically has an ijma, consensus on, which is that the universe had a beginning. They agree to that now. The reason that why they agree to this is because they know that the universe is constantly expanding. How do they know that? Is because there was a famous scientist in 1889, between the time of 1889 and 1953, Dr. Edwin Hubble. He was a highly renowned, respected, and well-known astronomer, person who studies outer space, and he discovered the redshift light pattern that all stars possess that proves that the universe is still expanding. So in physics, what we understand, Mohab, can you close the door because they're doing some vacuuming or something? So what they know in physics is that there's what's called the blue shift pattern and a red shift light pattern. If you see the blue shift light pattern, that means an object is moving closer towards you. And if you see the red shift light pattern, it means that an object is moving further away. So what Dr. Edwin Hubble discovered is that all the stars in the entire universe, without exception, have the red shift light pattern, which means that all of the stars are actually expanding outwards. So based on logic, if you were to reverse time, that expansion would turn into contraction, meaning that everything would continue to contract until it all came back to one point in the universe, meaning that the universe started off as one point, and it had to basically have begun to expand. So that's hence the Big Bang. You can almost call it the Big Bang law, even though some people might call it the Big Bang theory still. And if you look towards the Quran and Surah Al-Dhariyat, Allah tells us, we constructed the universe with power, and we are expanding it. Now, when Allah uses the word we here, whenever Allah, for example, uses any type of wording like nahnu, this is the royal we. So just in case a Christian asks you, why is Allah saying the word we in any context? We know that even the kings of old, as in, for example, in Britain, let's say in the 16th century, if a king or queen, and even till today, if the king or queen of England wanted to speak to her audience, she would use the form the royal we. She would say, and we have decreed this legislation or these sets of laws for you. So what this means is that this is a type of royal insignia. This is a type of way that people of royalty speak, or in this case, how the divine speaks, who is the Malik al-Mulk, who's the king of all of this universe. So it is befitting that Allah speaks in this form. And obviously, we also try to understand the Quran based on the muhkamat ayat before we try to understand mutashabihat ayat, which Allah told us in Surah Ali Imran. And He warned us that there are people who have perversions in their hearts. They look at the mutashabihat ayat first instead of the muhkamat. This is exactly the problem with the Christians. The Christians, they will look at clear verses in the Bible where it says God is one. that there are none other than me. Like, for example, in the book of Isaiah, when God said, I am your Lord and Savior, and there is none other than me. And they'll look at that and they'll be like, well, that's pretty obvious. Or, for example, the book of Numbers, chapter 19, verse 23, where it says that God is not a man, nor the son of a man. These are muhkamat evidences. These are clear-cut evidences. They don't have more than one meaning. But they will avoid looking at that, and they'll look at mutashabihat verses, ambiguous verses, to be like, oh, but then why did Jesus say, our Father who art in heaven? Like, why did he use this distinction? And we can explain that quite easily, and we already discussed this before. He said our Father, not his Father. And Father here is majazi, is metaphorical to mean our Creator. Back then, the Jews, and as well as the followers of Isa could easily distinguish that Father here does not mean biological father. There are many verses in the Bible that prove that. But the point here is that the Christians try to avoid the verses that say God is not a man, nor the son of a man, and try to make him into a man. This is the danger of using metaphorical evidences basically while ignoring the obvious muhkam evidences. So that's just something to keep in mind. So another evidence, so this has to do with a future prophecy, but during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So at that time, there were two superpowers. There were al-Faras, there was Persia, or the Sassanid Empire, some people call it. And then there was Ar-Rum, or the Romans, or the Byzantine Empire. These were basically the equivalent of modern-day America and China, the two heavyweights in terms of military power and strength in the world currently. Now, the Prophet ﷺ came with these ayat that predicted that the Romans would say the Romans have been defeated in the lowest land, but after their defeat, they will soon be victorious. Out of the two superpowers, it was known the Persians were the stronger of the two. And the Romans had just had a devastating blow towards their empire, to the point that anybody living at that time would say it's impossible for the Romans to make a comeback. Like, they would have literally just laughed at somebody if they tried to make this claim. But the Prophet ﷺ came with these ayat, and what's interesting is not only did the Romans defeat them within the timeline, so the Prophet ﷺ, basically, the word in Arabic essentially means 3 to 9 years. So I think it was around 7 or 8 years that the prophecy became fulfilled, where the Romans actually defeated the Persians, despite the fact that they were almost completely defeated prior. But there's another interesting thing about this ayah, where it mentions Adan al-Ardi, which means in the lowest land. So that's going to be really important when we look at the next slide, because that's another prophecy in and of itself. So if you look at on the screen now, it says the Dead Sea Rift Valley occupied Palestine and Jordan in October 1984, seen from the altitude of 190 nautical miles or 350 kilometers. So we're looking downward using satellite imaging. We're looking at the area where the Persians and the Romans fought during where this prophecy was going to take place. And it mentions that this area here, where this battle took place between the Persians and the Romans, it's called the Dead Sea Rift Valley. And this area, if you were to actually measure the what do you want to call it, the altitude, is it altitude? Or just basically like the height of the land, it is 1,292 feet or 394 meters below sea level. So it is the lowest place on earth. Adana, one of the meanings of that is the lowest. So they literally fought in the lowest region of land on the entire earth. How could Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam have known this based on, like, for example, modern scientific equipment or even whatever equipment existed at that time? There was nobody at that time that could say with certainty, based on just using scientific tools, that this was the lowest altitude on the face of the earth. Like, the earth is a massive place. There's 7 major continents. Like, well, it could have been in Antarctica, could have been in Africa, could have been in North America, South America, Europe. How would you know? Obviously, we know for sure because of what the Quran told us. Then later on, science finally caught up, obviously with the use of satellite technology, and you were able to verify that indeed what the Quran said is true, which is obviously what we believe, that they fought in the lowest land. Then the Quran talks about أَلَمْ نَجْعَلْ لِلْأَرْضِ مِهَادًا وَجِبَالَ أَوْتَادًا. Have we not made the earth as a wide expanse and the mountains as pegs? It's mentioned in Surah An-Naba. So we now know, and this diagram is actually taken from that book that I mentioned earlier in the slides, a guided or an illustrated guide to Islam, that first little mini booklet, 60 to 80 pages or so. So it has this diagram in there. So this is taken from a non-Muslim book, Anatomy of the Earth, and it mentions on page 220 that if you look at these different areas of where you find mountains, the British Isles, North Germany, the Alps, Europe, the Russian platform, and the Caucasus area of mountains, you can see, based on the diagram, that some of the roots of these mountains are as deep as around 60 to 70 kilometers under the earth. How could the Prophet ﷺ have known that these mountains have these deep-rooted pegs? This is something that you would need modern-day excavation equipment to be able to verify. So we can see here that because Allah is Al-Alim and all-knowing, He's giving us this in-depth precision to different scientific ayat on top of the fact that Islam is teaching us the moral code of how we should live our lives. And the word autada, like when you think of a peg, even for example, like a modern day tent peg, if you want to secure a tent, you want to go on a camping trip, do you put the majority of the peg above ground or below ground? Imagine you have a tent in front of you and you want to peg it down so the wind doesn't blow it away. You put the majority of the tent peg under the ground, right? So for example, let's say maybe 2/3. So the same thing is true with mountains as well as with icebergs, but we're talking about mountains at the moment here. So with mountains, the majority of the entire structure of the mountain is actually not above ground, but actually below ground, just like a real peg is used in real life. So even though mountains are massive, there's Mount Everest and barely anybody's ever climbed up the mountain. But if you think Mount Everest looks high from above, you should see what it looks like from below. Because the majority of mountains and icebergs, the structure is actually beneath the ground, not above. Another interesting point is that probably only in the last 100 years did we have a really solid understanding of embryology. There were some early theories and research, like for example, Galen from the Greek scientists and philosophers, he thought that chick embryos, that all the tissues inside of a little baby bird inside of an egg, he thought all the tissues grew at the same rate. It was just a theory at the time. The theory was wrong. But the Quran, obviously when it was revealed, it talked about the stages of embryology happening in different sequences. And not only that, because actually I didn't put up the verse on the screen for the stages of the bones and the muscles, because there are specific stages for that happening, but the one that I have on the screen right now has to do with the senses. We now also know, probably within the last 50 years, that within the science of embryology, that the human embryo develops hearing before it develops vision inside of the embryo. We know that for a fact now. The Quran is already alluding to the fact that hearing came before eyesight. When it mentions in Surah Sajda, then He proportioned him and breathed into him His spirit, then He gave you the hearing and the eyesight and the brains, but rarely do you give thanks. So here, hearing comes before eyesight, which is now known to be a fact. Then in terms of many of the steps of embryology, we know that, for example, Dr. Alexander Keith Moore, who became Muslim eventually, who was one of the top embryologists in the last 50 years, said that there is no way for it to be possible that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ could have guessed the sequence of these stages of embryology, and it must have come from God. There's YouTube recordings of him still saying that, and so you can take a look at that if you want. It's also found in the YouTube series called The Divine Book, which goes to prove that Islam is true, and it compares it to the other Abrahamic faiths. So the idea of conception, the embryo, the fetus, everything is in chronological order based on these ayat that have to do with embryology. Also, the word alaq, which basically means like an embryo, it has many meanings actually. The word alaq has three main meanings in the Arabic language, because this is what's being referred to as one of the main stages of the embryo. Alaq can mean a leech, it can mean something that is suspended or hanging, and it can mean a blood clot. And the embryo goes through all of these stages throughout its development. And you might say, how is that possible? For example, how is it, we'll start with the trickiest of the three, the blood clot. How is it a blood clot? Because the early forming egg, which becomes a blastocyst, so a multicellular little egg structure, which then connects to the uterine wall of the mother, and then it builds the connecting stalk. Before it actually has a pumping heart, the blood is actually like, yani, it's in a standstill. It's not circulating right away. So at first, it's just a cell which is connected to the uterine wall, which doesn't have flowing blood yet and doesn't have an active circulatory system. So in the beginning, it's basically a blood clot. It's kind of like having an aneurysm inside of your body. Now, an aneurysm could kill you, but the idea here is that if you have like a bulge in your blood vessel of just like something that just is building up, that's like the early formation of an embryo. So it starts off as a blood clot. And then as it's developing, that connecting stalk ends up being the thing which it suspends from. So to suspend means to hang. So it's hanging from the connecting stalk. So this is also the next attribute of an alaq. And then this blastocyst, this round cell, then starts to take the form of basically a worm-like structure as it's hanging there. So then it takes the shape of a leech. And if you were to look at a leech and an embryo at the microscopic level, not only would they look identical from the outside, they'd even look identical from the inside. You can see here the top head part of an embryo and the back end area of a leech, and it's virtually identical. Like, this is beyond the scope of the vision of the naked eye to see. You need to use high-tech modern-day equipment to see this at this level of embryonic development. So again, we ask the question, how could the Prophet ﷺ have known something with such depth and such precision? Like, yani, the mushrikeen who were living from Quraysh in the time of Mecca, they probably weren't even thinking about these things. And these weren't the main reasons why they were arguing or fighting with the Quran. But this just goes to show you something. It shows that the Quran is timeless. It shows that the Quran is ready to cater and to serve all of humanity, regardless of what time frame you lived in. If you came after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there are even signs for the future generations to be able to extract from the meanings and the ayat of the Quran. Another example, in 1880, Sir Francis Galton discovered that no human being has identical fingerprints. Even if we were to compare 1 million people or more than 1 million, everybody in this room and everybody that you know has a different fingerprint signature. Now, why is that important? Because Allah told us that does man think we will not reassemble his bones? Yes, indeed, we are able to reconstruct his fingertips. So He's explaining this to us for a reason. Why even mention something as subtle as the fingertips? Because in the subtlety of the fingertip is a unique print that everybody has their own. It's kind of like your own barcode. Every human being has their own product number, but in your case, it comes in the form of a fingerprint. And so even to this level of detail, Allah will reconstruct us on Yawm al-Qiyamah. Basically, Allah is telling us it's easy for Him, not only to just recreate us, to recreate us with such precision that even our fingerprint signature will be brought back. Then if we look at, in Surah An-Nisa, the idea of pain receptors. So we look at a famous scientist who became Muslim. He attended, I think, one of the famous conventions. This is the Saudi medical conference held in Riyadh. So he went to Saudi. He was in Riyadh, and they were discussing, many scientific miracles within the Quran. And when this particular professor, who was not Muslim at the time before he discovered all this stuff, or so he learned about all this, he realized that for the Quran to talk about neurology and for it to talk about the nervous system and the idea of pain receptors that are embedded within the skin, and that you have to keep renewing the skin in order for you to continue to feel pain, this was something that was way beyond the knowledge of people from 1400 years ago. This is another recent discovery, say in the last 100 to 200 years, where we knew for a fact that the nerves in the skin determine if you feel any pain on the skin ever again. So technically, if you get a third-degree burn and somebody hits you with a baseball bat, they stab you with a spike, they stab you, you're not going to feel anything on your skin whatsoever because all the nerves have been, the sensory nerves have been completely destroyed if it's a third degree burn. If it's like first degree, then obviously you're still going to have some nerve components, but it's embedded within the skin. Prior scientists would have thought, it's just connected to the brain or other parts of the body. But in this case, we know for a fact that if we're talking about this area of the body being completely burnt, you will feel nothing in this area. It'll be completely numb. And so the Quran tells us, those who reject our signs, we shall soon cast into the fire. As often as their skins are roasted through, we shall change them for fresh skins, that they may taste the penalty. Why does Allah talk about renewing the skin? Because it's known that the skin is where the sensory receptors for pain are. If you remove those, you remove the pain. So Allah is telling us, as regarding these kuffar that are going to be burning in the hellfire, this skin will continue to be renewed so that they never basically escape the continual pain of the hellfire. So that man, Professor Taijan, or however you pronounce his name, that Asian guy, he accepted Islam after finding out about this ayah. All living things are made from water, which is talked about in Surah An-Nur. So Allah tells us, actually there's maybe more than one reference, because it also says here in Surah Al-Furqan, chapter 24, verse 5, we have created every human being from water. We now know this for a fact. Not only is every organic, biotic, living organism composed of water, and obviously it requires food either by making it in terms of like being a producer like a plant, or consuming food as being a consumer like an animal. Not only do we know that, but every cell within the human body and within biotic structures possesses water. And usually it's in a high percentage. So if you look at the total body composition of a human being, we're about 67 to 70% water. On top of the fact that we're mostly water, in each cell, each of our cells is 50 to 90% water, what you would call the cytoplasm. Cyto means cell in Greek, and plasm is referring to the water. So the majority of each of your cells is water, as well as your body as a whole. And hence, it makes perfect sense how Allah tells us we have created every human being from water. There are two scientific signs regarding this next sign here, at least. So in Surah An-Nur, chapter 24, verse 40, it talks about, or they are like darknesses within an unfathomable sea. Allah is talking about the kuffar, which is covered by waves, upon which are waves, over which are clouds of darkness, some of them upon others. When one puts out their hand therein, he can hardly see it. And he to whom Allah has not granted light, for him there is no light. So Allah is telling us that the kuffar, they have multiple levels or grades of darkness that's preventing them from seeing the light of Islam, from having iman in their heart. And what's interesting about this ayah is, even though it's talking about something very moral here, the idea of like how the kuffar are being immoral, and that Allah is the one who guides people to morality, but on top of that, there's a scientific sign embedded in here. Allah said, covered by waves upon which are waves. We now know, probably based on the last couple hundred years or so, that there's two things going on here. One is that there are waves above waves. We now know that there are internal waves underneath the ocean that you cannot see with the naked eye. When you look at the ocean, you see on top, you see the top wave. You see it brushing across the shoreline. What you don't see is there's actually another wave underneath that wave, kind of like layers of a cake. So in the depths of the ocean are internal waves that are also moving. So the Quran is alluding towards that as well. It also mentions that when one puts out their hand, he can hardly see it. So we're talking about waves underneath waves. If you keep going deep underneath the ocean to the lower area of the internal waves, you're going to notice something. Well, actually, you won't notice it unless you have breathing equipment or a submarine. Once you get to around 200 meters, you would have died by that point because you would have stopped being able to breathe. But if you had breathing equipment or you had a submarine, you would notice something, that everything starts to get dark around the 200-meter mark. You start to no longer be able to fully see things at that light. You start to see, even if you can watch YouTube. First, colors start to kind of fade away. Certain colors fade away quickly. And then once you get down to 1,000 meters, if you go to that depth, using scuba diving equipment, or if you have a submarine, it'll be pitch black. There'll be no light whatsoever. So on top of the fact that Allah spoke about internal waves, hidden waves below the surface waves underneath the ocean, if you actually also descend further into the depths, you couldn't do this with obviously just your lungs and swimming downward, but if you had modern day equipment like a submarine, if you go past 1 kilometer or 1,000 meters, it's going to be completely dark. So two embedded scientific signs within these ayat that are talking about how the kuffar have multiple layers of darkness that are preventing them from seeing the light of Islam. So if you want to see more scientific signs, these are some resources that I would highly recommend. So the book that I mentioned earlier, out of the 3 books, one of them was Scientific Truths in the Quran by the Quran Project, easily downloadable by PDF. Just Google search the key terms and Quran Project. The second thing being Quran in Modern Science. This is a video actually, a YouTube video. It's 2 hours, 14 minutes and 56 seconds of Dr. Zakir Naik just going through one scientific ayah after another. So over 2 hours of proofs from the Quran. And he mentions that there are at least 1,000 scientific ayat in the Quran. So, like I said before from the beginning of the lecture, we're not going to focus on theories. We're not going to talk about things that the scientific community is still in disagreement about, that they don't have ijma about. But if there's a consensus that something is a scientific fact, then those ayats that perfectly match proving that, we can discuss those particular issues. And this video is phenomenal. Like I remember watching this maybe like 5-10 years ago when I got some of my students at Al Taqwa Academy to watch it, and it's just a mind-blowing video. Like if you need just something that's not going to be so rigorous and maybe so much, not take too much time, or maybe you're not much of an avid reader, you just want to watch something, this is an amazing video to watch by Dr. Zakir Naik, which is the main student, we said, of Ahmed Deedat. So, other scientific signs, how the universe was described as smoke. If we look at, for example, the supernovas of the planets, you'll notice that it's basically just hot gas, the stuff that makes nebulas that make up the majority of the cosmos. If you actually look with a telescope and you see all those big masses of gas, like now we have, does anybody know what's the name of that new super high resolution telescope, the latest one? Does anybody remember what that thing is called? I forgot, but it has like these stunning images of like, you can see like all these blue and red and black smoky images around the stars. So that's that dukhan that we're talking about here. Because you can see that kind of, that hot gassy smoke within the sky that makes up the future, the to come stars, made of mainly like helium and hydrogen. But those interstellar gases that form nebulas, that stuff can be seen with high-tech telescopes. So that dukhan is spoken about in the Quran. The orbits of the sun and the moon. For thousands of years, the scientific community did not even think that the, They thought, for example, they thought that the, couple things here. They thought that the earth was the center of the universe, and they found out later on that that's not actually true, that it actually orbits around the sun. And what they also didn't think is that they used to think the sun doesn't move. They thought it was stuck in one place within orbit. But we now know that the sun has its own orbit, and we also know that the moon has its own orbit, which is also discussed in the Quran as well. The spherical shape of the earth. For a long time, people thought the earth was flat. The Quran already talked about the spherical nature of the earth. We already discussed the chronological stages of embryology. So that's why it's worth taking some time to look at some of these small science booklets that we mentioned in the PowerPoint, so that you guys can have those ayat at your fingertips when you start doing dawah, either in social media, casually, over a cup of coffee, or any other means that you find is beneficial. I hope that you guys benefited from today's lesson. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.